Welcome to Disruptive Successor, a show for next generation leaders in family businesses and entrepreneurs who want to disrupt the status quo and take their existing business to a whole new level. We all know that what got us here isn't going to get us there. This show will provide inspiration, advice, and resources to help you create massive impact. This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Hi, it's Jonathan Goldhill, and welcome back to another episode of the Disruptive Successor Show. Today, we're going to be delving into a case study with Phelps Wood, who has a background as a business executive. Phelps advises closely held companies to achieve growth, value, and succession goals of the owner. And Phelps works primarily with families to perpetuate multi-generational businesses and founders seeking exit alternatives. When appropriate, he provides coaching to current or next generation owners. And Phelps recently went through his own family's exit. In case we have a great case study we're going to talk about today. So Phelps, welcome to the show today.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so fantastic. So, let's just start off with some understanding about like succession versus exit planning.
Sure.
There's a real distinction. I think these terms are largely not understood or not thought about by a lot of business owners. And so, tell us what your take on the distinction between the two is.
Sure. Well, so you mentioned one piece, which is not thought about by business owners. I think that's the key is that whether you're going to call it succession planning or exit planning, it's something that business owners need to be thinking about. Mm-hmm. And like a lot of things that need planning, they need to be thinking about it earlier rather than later. They're long. I think both of them are long processes. I mean, I've seen people talk about exit planning and, all right, well, we have a 3-month exit planning kind of curriculum. Right. That's a pretty tight time frame for really tight. Anybody. I've seen the same on the succession side. It's, I think, too tight on either of those cases. It's a little bit of semantics, but I think people hear exit planning and they think of an exit like a sale, kind of a complete exit from the business. That's not always the case. Certainly it is if you're selling the business, whether it's to management or an outside buyer, private equity. But succession planning, I think people think about, how it's a longer term process. Think about how do I set up the business so that if there's an emergency, there's a successor, but also if I'm going to try to transition this to the next generation, how do I think about doing that? Who do I do it to, whether it's one or multiple family members, and what's the time frame that looks like? What are the capabilities that those people need to have? I mean, there's a whole bunch of pieces that go into it. I think they're related. I mean, I think that you could probably use the same term to mean the same thing. Yeah. But I personally think people get stuck on exit planning and think of a sale, and succession planning, they think of kind of a longer process and transitioning maybe to a family member of that.
Yeah, so I would agree with you 100%. And so, one of the complications today, and I'd love to hear your comment on this, is that families have spread out around the globe. And so, the classic family farm where everyone's, was raised on the farm, stays on the farm. I mean, I think of members of my family and how scattered they are around the world. But, the geographic distancing of families makes forming and maintaining personal connections more difficult. And this makes for difficulty in the succession and exit planning process. And
sure.
I think you experienced that a little bit in your own business.
Sure. I mean, I think, one of the, they talk about like the 5 Ds of businesses, which are none of them are positive, death and disability and dissolution, divorce. One of them is departure. Right. And so whether that be somebody who's in the business and departs for a better job or because they're disgruntled or whatever reason, I think that, talking about a geographic distancing, I mean, when somebody leaves a geographic area, I mean, whether it's moving from Southern California to Northern California or from, mainland China to Europe or the US, it becomes that much more difficult to keep certainly the family ties, but also the if there is a business relationship, the business relationship piece. So that's certainly a threat. Things like this, like Zoom and that are somewhat solutions, but depending on the business, it's very, I still think it's very difficult to manage by Zoom. I think we've only seen a couple of years of it here.
Right.
So we'll see how that affects kind of businesses moving forward. But depending on the type of business, it's more or less difficult to do. Certainly, if you have, like, for example, a real estate business and you're geographically concentrated, how are you going to manage that if that happens to be, your business?
I think it's also, things have gotten complicated where, and this happened generations ago, but some family members get into the business and some don't.
Mm-hmm.
Some feel a sense of obligation and stay around, or they come back to be in the family business, and others feel like, they want to spread their wings and do other things and be challenged. So, why don't we start with maybe a little bit of the history of your family business and how you got into this space, transitioning from being a business executive to suddenly being the person who was in charge of the exit succession plan in your own family business.
Sure.
Tell us a little about the business.
Those are kind of two different, stories. I mean, I guess that the business is a manufacturer. It still exists. The business is a manufacturing business, manufacture electronic test accessories, sold primarily to the medical, the electronic device market, through some big distributors here in the US, some to the automotive market. I mean, really any place where you're doing testing, where you're connecting a test meter to the thing that you're testing, whether it's a car, brain now, or a chip, or some medical device. My family's business made those connectors.
Gotcha.
And my father and his father were manufacturers' representatives back in kind of the 60s and early 70s. And this was a company that they repped. And there was a guy in the middle of the country making these parts kind of out of his basement. And he didn't want to do it anymore. And my father bought the company from him with his brother, his father, and a fourth partner. And they ran it, grew it and ran it from early, I think 1971 was the purchase date. My dad was there up until his death. And we bought certain partners out over time. My grandfather passed away. And so by the time my father passed away, he was the sole owner. There was a kind of a ownership structure was a little bit funky because of those prior buyouts. My brother and my sister each owned 10% that they'd earned kind of by working there. So they owned that individually, but my father was the 80% owner.
Gotcha.
And I don't know if you want me to transition to kind of how
So you weren't in the business per se, right? And
I was not.
You chose not to be in the business until.
Well, I worked for him. I did work for the business for a year. I worked for a year after, kind of before I moved back east, and then ended up in grad school. So I did spend a year. And as a kid, I worked there every summer. I mean, actually, my father the business had home workers, so people who would come to work to assemble things, come pick up parts, take them to their home, assemble them, and bring them back. Some of these are subcomponents in that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that stuff kind of is gone now in California because it was all 1099 and they changed some of those laws.
Right.
But so as a little kid, I mean, I made stuff at the kitchen table, and got paid a piece rate to do that. I worked there in the summer when I was older, on the factory floor. So I didn't have a great knowledge of what was going on in the business, but I certainly was around the business as a kid. And I think that's very common in a lot of family businesses. Kids are kind of introduced to the business by their parents because it's such an important part of their life.
Mm-hmm.
The people that work there, some of the individuals end up almost as family members,
Yep.
So I certainly had worked there, but I had not worked in the business really other than 1 year kind of in my adult life.
Okay. And so what brought you back to the business?
Well, I mean, that kind of what brought me, I was talking with my father before he passed away. I spent a lot of time talking to him about succession planning.
Yeah.
What do you want to do? How do you, because I was concerned that this could be an issue I have 2 siblings,
yep.
and that this could end up being an issue for us. Whether it be from a financial or tax standpoint or interpersonal,
What was your dad's response to these repeated attempts to talk to him about it?
Well, I mean, we talked a lot about it, but we never got anywhere.
Gotcha.
So, I think that there was a fair amount, and I think this is common. So a friend of mine who buys companies. He buys a lot of very, very small companies, kind of, 500 to 3 million EBITDA companies.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little private equity firm basically. And they buy a lot of companies from families, either to help them with the succession or because there is no succession piece. But talking with him, he has this rule, he called it like the 40-70 rule, that they never successfully bought a company from somebody under 40.
Right.
Or over 70. So,
okay.
There's this, and I can't remember if those are the exact numbers, but I think that's a good, there's a sweet spot, I think, in kind of succession planning. That, you start doing it too early and you're like, when you're 35, you're still a little, if your company's doing well, you have no interest in leaving,
Sure.
And your kids are, it's too young to start planning, most likely, even if you're 40 and you had kids when you're 20, you're not going to hand over the reins when they're 20. So between that 40 and 70-year-old, age, you got to start doing some thinking about this.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're over 70, you're probably there because you don't want to leave. You either you haven't saved enough to be able to do this. Your business, you're taking so much out of the business that you've got such an extravagant lifestyle that you can't afford to do it, or you just love it so much and you don't have any outside kind of hobbies in that you don't really know what you'd do if you left. And so I think there was a little bit of the last piece for my father. He had other hobbies and he was a very gregarious guy. He had lots of friends, but he just loved his business and it's what he'd done. And he was working with, 2 of his, with my 2 siblings. So he saw most of his family every day. And he saw some other people that he'd worked with for years and years and years. So I think it was very hard. I think I just don't think he could kind of get his hands around, retirement, I guess.
Yeah.
You've talked with some other people. I think I've seen some of your podcasts about kind of that, how to do that or half retirement or whatever. And I just don't think he did.
I don't think for that.
Yeah. I just don't think he found a way to kind of do that.
Gotcha. So he was a victim of one of the 5 Ds, I take it. And could you take us through, because we've never really talked about the 5 Ds on this show.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, so people talk about the 5 Ds. I guess I'll list them. It's disability, departure,
right?
Dissolution, divorce, and death.
Correct.
I mean, death, I think everybody knows what death is. People know what divorce is. Divorce causes problems if, depending on the ownership, but it also strains family ties, certainly. Departure can be, that could be the departure of family members, or it could be the departure of, kind of key employees. And, disability, that you could lump kind of mental health in there, I guess, but it could also be somebody could be incapacitated with a stroke. They're not dead, right. But if there's not some decision making and some rules put in place, that becomes a real problem. And dissolution is really more, the business just dissolves for whatever reason. It goes out of business or bankrupt or something. But I don't know that those are, people talk about those. And then there's some other people talk about like for certainties. Right. Death is a certainty. Yes. Everyone's going to die. Right. Yeah. So in a family business, new entrants are a certainty. So whether it be a new entrance from a sibling or daughter or son who comes into the business, or you have new spouses that come into the family. They may not be in the business, but I promise you they have opinions about the business or they will in short time. Sure. I mentioned behavioral health, but also inequality. So inequality is another. Inequality relates to either how people were treated unequally, or they feel that they were treated unequally, or they have different skill sets. And they're just by nature, people are not equal. And so it's hard, but it's hard in a family. Everyone should be treated equal, but in a family business, you get into, do they have the skill sets or not? That's a different issue.
Super difficult stuff. Okay. So there was a first shock in your family, which was the death of your dad. At 82 years of age, and it was unexpected.
Yeah, I say, I now have enough distance, on this to at least find a tiny bit of humor in it, I guess. But the unexpected owner death at the age of 82, that seems to be, 82. I know that people live a lot longer than that, right? But if you'd known my father, he was in great health. He was very active. And so that was the unexpected part. But people dying at the age of 82 is not unexpected. And so, ideally we would have had more planning around the succession piece of that. Right. And I think, one thing that I wanted to mention is people think about estate planning, but estate planning is not succession planning.
Correct.
Estate planning is deciding kind of how things get divided, but it does, when you've got a business involved, it does not, it rarely, I should say, a really good estate plan will incorporate that, but rarely does that kind of solve all the issues that a business needs, and really those business issues need to be solved by individuals who are around after the death.
Right.
So there's got to be a mechanism in place to kind of, how do you address that?
So in your family's case, was there an estate plan that your dad had already put together?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What would have happened, do you think, if that wasn't in place?
Well, it would have been, so his estate plan was a little more involved. It wasn't just a trust. So my parents had a trust. We also had a family limited partnership. And that family limited partnership owned some of the business. The general partner of that limited partnership was my parents' trust. Okay. So there were mechanisms with which to at least legally make decisions. But on the business side, not everybody had check writing ability. They're, kind of those simple access things like that. But I guess going back to your question was what would have happened if there had not been like a trust?
Yeah. Or a plan, really more of a plan.
Well, there was, I guess I don't know. I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about that, to be honest. Okay, it would have been, well, one, without a trust, you end up in probate.
Right.
And in California, that's the last place you want to be, especially if you're running a business, because you can't make decisions for the business without a probate court order. And that is, I've been through that. I've been through a probate piece, not with a business, but with just a family, with my father-in-law and his home. I mean, really, he had one large asset, which was a home and some investments in that. But that is a real pain in the butt.
I bet it is. All right, so let's move on from there. So, so what did you find? The unexpected death of your father, and did this bring you together with your brother and sister? And like, what was the state of the business at that point?
Well, so the business was okay. The business had been a little bit. So this was in 2019. This happened in 2019. My father passed away earlier in the year. Mm-hmm. And, there were a couple series of events though in the business. I mean, we'd lost the main engineer several years before that. He had died in an accident. And so there were some pieces that were missing. And, while my dad was 82 and was, he was contributing to the business. The question is how much, but he was contributing to the business. And really, I think the biggest contribution was all ultimate decisions flowed through him. Mm. And so, if you don't, and so I don't think that we as a family my siblings had all the experience that you'd really want to have at that time of running a business, making those decisions, and going through those conversations that you have to have, some of the tough conversations to do that. So, they talk about like conflict in a family business. I mean, you're always going to have it. You're not going to eliminate it. You just have to manage it. And usually you can manage it. One of the ways to manage it is by really clear communication and having some protocols involved and having goals in that. And there were a lot of those things that were missing on our front. And so we just weren't good at making those decisions. We'd never had a board. A board had technically existed, but we'd never met as a board, even as a family. So a couple of things that certainly there's the shock of the death. And so you're grieving the loss of a parent. What we did, we put together, our board. It was really my mother and my siblings and I, and we started meeting regularly on that to start to chart a course for the business, which had not been charted before that, really. And one of the first things that I found was that there's kind of silos of information. I mean, I mentioned that there was a private partnership that owned part of the business.
Right.
There were four. I mean, if you include, so the business was it was in a building that my family owned separate from the business. There were four, between like the building and the business, there were four general partnerships. A DISC, which is called a Domestic International Sales Corporation. It's a way to save taxes on foreign sales, specifically for manufacturers. It's kind of a funky part of the tax code. So there was a DISC, but it has its own kind of corporation. It's got its own accounting. We had the company itself, which was a C Corp. We had that limited partnership that I mentioned. And then we've got ownership by a trust and individual. So you've got all these entities.
Right.
And it's very hard to figure out, because the one was a leasing company that owned equipment, that leased to the business. And, it's kind of hard to figure out, like, are we making money or not making money? And where are we making money? And all of a sudden you've got cash in one entity. You really need it somewhere else to grow the business. So one of the things we did first was to actually sit down and talk about what I called Wood Inc. Our last name is Wood. So let's talk about everything together. And I wish I could show you a flow chart. Your podcast listeners wouldn't be able to see it, but it was a mess. I mean, you need to have a whiteboard to get this stuff kind of figured out. And what you realize is that nobody in the family knew how all this stuff interrelated. None of the no outside advisor really had a full view of all of this either. The accountants do the taxes and that, but they don't really think of it from a high level of how does all this flow and does it make sense, and et cetera. So I think that was one of the keys for us to kind of get our hands around. All right, what do we have? This is bigger than the business itself, but kind of what do we have from a business standpoint? Of these, there's a fair amount of entities. Where is the cash flows going? What's going on here? Is this helping or hurting the actual business itself? and how do we get our kind of grips around dealing with some of this stuff.
Now, how much did you figure out before COVID hit, like a year later?
So we shut down, like we had this kind of a partnership that was like a sales, it was like a commission sales piece that had been around since my dad and his father had were manufacturers reps. We shut that down. We had the leasing company. We changed ownership of that. We actually bought my mom out of that so that just to kind of clean some stuff up. So my brother and sister and I owned that, a third each. I did a bunch of stuff within the limited partnership to kind of clean stuff up. Some of that was really unrelated to the business. But so we had a fair amount. COVID hit a year later. We got a fair amount done in there. There was also, so financially, the company owned insurance on my dad. So there were some insurance funds that came to the company. It wasn't structured like everybody thought it was. The bulk of it ended up going to my mom. It was a split dollar policy. And insurance is a whole nother funky piece that I'm afraid to wade any further into it than what I dealt with. But yeah, there are you got to know what the policy is, who's going to pay out to, and what its purpose is. Otherwise, it doesn't necessarily help you. This helped us, but it didn't help as much as I think some people had hoped. But so we were able to pay off interfamily debt and some outside debt with that. So we really went into COVID with zero debt, some additional cash on the balance sheet because of that insurance cash and some operating cash. Mm-hmm. So we were, pretty well set up, I think, going into COVID, as well as you could be, at least financially.
But I imagine COVID had a big impact on your ability to manufacture and also supply chain.
So initially it didn't. Initially, actually, what we saw was people pushed forward their ordering because they were concerned about what was going to happen. So we actually had kind of a rush of orders, especially from medical equipment manufacturers, that wanted our parts. Right. Then later, kind of the supply chain piece hit. And because the lockdowns lasted so long, and really a lot of the devices we supply to the medical market are for elective aspects. They'd already kind of stockpiled all of that. So then we saw a dip in orders from them until kind of some of those mandates to eliminate elective surgery and that elective disappeared, and then they started coming back again. But
all right, and then there was a second shock, I understand, in your business, which was the geographical departure of a sibling who was running.
Yeah. So I think that was the biggest shock, the biggest COVID shock for us was, my one sibling moved family to Utah, and that was a decision around their kids and schools and that, which made, complete sense for them, and was really the best thing, I think, for them to do. At least they decided that was the best thing for them to do, but it wasn't really the best thing for the business. This was the person who was running, she was running the business basically. So the president of the business, and, so that kind of precipitated another family, discussion around, all right, well, what do we do here? Are we going to, is this something that's going to work for the business? Is this not going to work for the business? And if it's not going to work, how are we going to address this? And we had kind of been going through some other aspects right before that. And I brought in 2 outside advisors to kind of help us on that, just to be kind of third party eyes. And kind of surprised. It was just the communication around this was poor. That was the biggest problem. And to be honest, what happened, I think one of the things that people forget is that, if you've got a plan, then when when stuff hits the fan, you can adjust that plan and move through it, and if you don't have a plan, and crap hits the fan, then emotions get really high. And this was a case where since there wasn't a plan for this to happen, and it kind of people were caught by surprise. People felt that they were, that the communication hadn't been good. I think emotion levels rose, and actually the emotion levels rose with those two individuals as well, those outside advisors I had brought in, because they had been working for a couple months with me and my family to address some of this, and it caught them by surprise too.
Right.
And in retrospect, had we hired kind of an outside person to like somebody like what I'm doing now to do this, I think they would have been able to kind of say, whoa, time out, like let's clear the deck, everybody take a deep breath and let's work through this. And that's one of my biggest regrets is I think that some of these decisions were made, including by myself, at kind of a heightened emotional level.
If you were to go through this again and put together a business owner advisory team, what I call a boat, who would you have on in the boat?
For the purposes of what we like our planning, like succession?
For Wood Inc., or just, you can be more general to people who are dealing with one of the 5 Ds and needing to put together an advisory team and, making good choices around what an accountant, a lawyer, maybe it's even an estate planning lawyer, maybe it's a securities lawyer. I mean, what would you be looking for? Would it depend on each situation be a little bit different? Probably.
I think each situation is a little bit different. I think, what we found ourselves in was a little bit of was like a slow fuse crisis, right? I mean, founder passed away, didn't have a succession plan. In less than a year or about a year later, COVID hits. That's its own issue. And then there's a departure of a key employee. So that kind of put us into a little bit of a crisis mode. What does this mean? It also, both from a business and from a family. I mean, I remember we've got a surviving spouse. I mean, my mom, who's 80, who lost her husband a year earlier, and now a sibling that is moving away with her family that lives very close to her. So there's, and you can't gauge what that means emotionally to some people and how that factors into some of the business decisions then. But to go back to your question, I think, you've got to get your hands around the financials of not only the business, but I'd say don't think of it as family business, but think of it as kind of family enterprise. So the whole family enchilada, so to speak. You've got to understand, what the finances are and what the interplay is between all of that. So that could be an accountant if they've got a big picture view. It could be a financial planner. Could be a combination of those two. At some point, you're probably going to need some legal help, certainly on the estate planning side, if that's where you need to kind of draw up some things. But you may just need a good business lawyer if you're looking at, shareholder agreements or buy-sell agreements or pieces of that. I think if you're wrestling with, business issues, like specifically business issues, you're going to want somebody, maybe like in your shoes that's got so they can help on the business consulting side. And then, if it's a family business or founder-led business, you're probably, you're talking about succession. You're going to want somebody who's has some practice kind of going through that. So that's either a family business advisor. There are some people in those other, areas, those other kind of advisor areas that have done that and that are good at doing that. But I think you got to find somebody who is less transactional and more strategic, I guess. And some of them, almost philosophical, because you're going to be asking those types of questions of, Jonathan, what are your goals? What are your goals for yourself and your business and your kids and your family? Not, what percentage do you want Fred to have and what percentage do you want Sue to have? That's, you get to that part later. So I don't know. Did I answer that question for you?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think it really is pretty situational dependent, and you need to be thinking about these different types of advisors. There are exit planners out there, certified exit planners. I mean,
I'm one as well.
Okay.
So yeah, I know you talked with somebody from the exit planning,
yep.
Snyder.
Yeah.
There.
Yep.
Right. No, and I think that's a good, and I think that's a good organization. And I think that's a good start for people. And I think that those people who've gone through that kind of exit planning, that SEPA, or there are some other credentials, they understand the language. And I would hope, I've worked with some that they understand that you need a team, that it's not all solved by one person. I think that's actually the most important piece of that, right. Is that, you back to your point, is you've got to figure out who's going to be in the boat.
Right. And, it can be the general contractor, if you will, could be someone inside the family. Sounds like you were that GC in your family's business from what you've told me. Or it could be that certified exit planner, or it could be, one of the key advisors who really took the lead. I mean, the leadership is going to emerge or evolve, but probably the biggest challenge is getting alignment around the issues,
right?
The going forward, plan, and if there isn't some bylaws that spells out how these decisions are made, even if there is bylaws spelling out how these decisions are made, I mean,
the bylaws don't really help you unless everybody is agreed on them.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, you have to have a plan, but I think it was Mike Tyson, right? He said everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? And so we got punched in the mouth twice, and we didn't have as concrete a plan as we would have liked, you know. But I think
that's what. Do you feel, Phelps? Do you think that's what's key to a family preserving the business into the next generation, is having a plan and having it be discussed and understood by all?
Yes, I think that long-term success depends on the ability to form, communicate, and align around a plan. And then you have to make sure you also have the skill set and the work ethic to execute that plan going forward.
Right.
So it's not just it's not just having a plan. Wasn't there remember that book, The Secret? If you think positive things will happen.
Yes.
Well, you got to work, right. I mean, you got to work at it.
Right.
It helps to think positive, but you also have to work positively too.
Gotcha. Well, so as we start to wrap up here, what were some of the lessons that you learned? Maybe any changes in perspective? Obviously, it's put you into a whole new career now, and that's certainly a good result. But what were some of your key takeaways from this whole process?
Well, actually, it's funny. It's almost a year to the date that we kind of signed this,
Right.
And I think, I still kind of keep thinking of kind of lessons learned from that. And I think the further kind of the more distance I get from that, the better I'm able to look back and see, both some positive things that came out of it, as well as some of the things that I would have liked to have done better. I think, I think the one lesson learned is, communicate early and often, right? And the communication, you've almost got to put procedures in place to ensure that communication happens, and the more disparate you are, as you mentioned, like geographic and that, the more you have to kind of do that. And some of that, some of that people call it governance or structures around that, but there just needs to be kind of really clear, what it is? It's really boundaries. And just like in a family where you need some boundaries in business, especially in a family business, you need those boundaries, and those boundaries, can help or hurt your communication. But communicating and getting aligned on goals is absolutely key for any business, but especially for a family business. I think
as we've learned in other shows, the importance of having different meetings happening. So like there's a leadership team and there's a management team, and they're in different rooms having different meetings. The ownership team is in another room, and the family is even in a separate room. And there's probably a lot of overlap between the ownership team and the family, maybe 100%.
Well, right. And I mean, that's, I think there's different, you've seen probably like the three circles of kind of family. Yep. And then there's, there's another group that has kind of a 4-room piece, as you're just mentioning.
Yep, the band, it's Josh Barron who was on.
I think you have to be conscious. I think you always have to be conscious of what hat are you wearing.
Yes.
And it's really hard, right? I mean, because you're wearing, when you're in a you might be sitting in a conversation and the question is, am I wearing, my board hat? Am I wearing my shareholder hat? Am I wearing my CEO hat? I mean, certainly as a CEO, I want to pay myself as much as I can pay myself because I want more money. But can I, as a board member, am I going to let that fly? As a shareholder, what about the other shareholders, right? I mean, you represent all of them. So until you get some practice switching, I mean, it's a little bit like schizophrenic, but until you get some practice going through that, I think it's really hard. It's really hard. And that makes it, if you don't practice that, then it's hard for you to see the viewpoint of others who are coming at it from a different perspective. Right.
Well, it's been a great conversation. Any other changes in perspectives or lessons learned that you want to share?
No, other than I think, I mentioned I think you have to address succession and exit planning, but succession, you have to address those issues and the tough issues in the family business. It's best to address those issues, in times of calm, because you can't do it when emotions are running hot or in the middle of a crisis. It's kind of too late. And so, like anything, the time to plan is when you don't need to plan, right? I mean, you don't feel that you need to plan, but I think just like families are evolving, family businesses are ever evolving. So you have to just continue those kind of planning, those conversations over and over again.
Understood and agreed. So Phelps, if people want to get in touch with you, you have an email, which we'll put at the show notes.
Sure.
But it is, just to be clear, it's Phelps@tracearcospartners.com. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And is there a significance to the name Trace Arcos Partners?
Well, Tres Arcos is Spanish for 3 arches, and there's an area in Southern California that my dad loved that has that name. So that's the significance.
Perfect tribute to your dad. Well, thanks so much for sharing your story. So, folks, hopefully you've learned something from this, and you've thought a little more deeply about maybe we need to put together something for our family business. Maybe it's a board. Maybe it's some governance structures. Maybe it's an estate plan that you've been sitting on that's long overdue. So I hope you'll reach out to someone, maybe one of us, to get some help, a referral, to just take this business that you've worked so hard to build and put it into the hands of the next generation leaders, or if they're not capable, plan your exit. But succession and exit planning, so important to the business. And Phelps, once again, it's great to have you on the show today.
It's great to be here, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
People need to hear these lessons. All right, folks, you know the drill. If you like this show, please share it with others. Also, give us a 5-star rating or review on your listening podcast of choice. And stick around for future episodes of the Disruptive Successor Show.
This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Thank you for joining us on the Disruptive Successor podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, review, and share with a friend who would benefit from the message. If you're interested in picking up a copy of my book, Disruptive Successor, go to disruptivesuccessor.com.